Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Um, Main thing you can do to support the show, besides subscribing at Subscribestar, which is really appreciated, or contributing with Bitcoin, both these things are in the description, is to share this. Something you can do for free. Share this on your social networks with your friends. Tell them how much you like the show and like the video on YouTube. Those things help the show grow. And we've been putting work into this. We'd like to see it grow. And we've got more work coming, as you can see visually. There's some lights to buy, which I hope to do in the new year. Okay, so we have Ryan Turnipseed with us. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you doing?
Doing good. Let me just see. I see something in. Oh, great. Okay, Mad Merc is trying to join. Um,
Ah, well, we get him.
okay. Yeah, sorry. Let me just make sure he's rolling. Um, okay, let's see. You might turn me down in your headphones a little bit if you can without having trouble hearing me, because I think it's coming through a little bit, Ryan. Um,
Oh,
okay,
okay.
so let's
Sorry.
see. Yeah, there we go. Okay, sorry. Wait a sec. Let's switch to. Okay. Welcome, Mad Merc. Say hi.
Hi.
Okay, you sound quiet in my ear, but you
Is the
sound.
show live?
Yes, we
Yes.
are live. Sorry.
We
Yeah, I threw you right into
we're,
it.
yeah, you threw me right into it. Oh shit.
Okay, and I think you don't look quiet there, but you hear quiet in my ear. I don't know if you can do anything to be a little louder. I don't know if I can do anything.
I've put output to the max on my side. How's that?
Okay, okay, I can hear you. Okay, all right. Okay, so we're going to discuss this paper I did. Well, I've done. I've had. Okay, wait. We'll get to that. What was I going to say, Ryan? Oh yeah, yeah. I wanted to mention that I did do an outside appearance this week that I thought came out rather well. I was on a dissident right wing tradition called Millennial, which is organized ably by millennial woes. Um, and if I can find the right window here, yeah, here's a link to it. And I'd encourage y'all to watch it because I don't get as personal on this show, I realize. And fair to say, Ryan, that in my interview, you got more of a picture of me and my background, and right?
Yes, certainly. It had a really great portion of your personality into it. It was your line of work, so I mean, that also contributed to it. And it was, overall, just in a way, it was kind of moving because it's just
Hmm.
with the topic that we're going over, democide. It's hard not to get some sort of emotion into that from the people talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I mentioned that as part of it, but I also just talked about a lot of stuff. Thanks, Lady of
Yep.
Shalott. She said you were brilliant. So yeah, I've had some good feedback on that interview. I forget how long it is. Actually, I should be able to see. It's hour and 48 minutes altogether. Wow, it flew right by. I'll say that. But anyway, uh, encourage you to watch that, and I think you'll find. I hope you'll find it interesting. Get to know me a little better. I talk about my family and all kinds of stuff. Uh, how my dad turned from politics to the ministry, and anyway. Okay, so having said all that, the topic of the day is my paper. Oh, no, there is one more thing, which is 1 week from today is final show of the year, and that is going to be our Christmas show and slash um, flag competition. So, Mad Merc, did we come up with a deadline for final entries?
I believe we did. Give me 2 seconds to look what I
Okay.
wrote so I'm
Yeah.
accurate
Oh, yeah,
for the
yeah.
show.
You put it there. So it's in.
Correct. Let me just have a look. Okay, yes. So the competition closes at 23:59, the 20th of December. That's GMT time.
Right.
Okay? So I'll say that again. 23:59, the 20th of December, GMT. That is when the
And
competition closes.
Right, and you participate through the Discord, so probably fair to share that link real quick. You can literally jump in, join our Discord, link in the live chat right now. Jump in, join our Discord, get a flag design in there before 20th is Monday, so before Monday, and participate and possibly win prizes. So if nothing else, we'll have fun talking about what you submit. So have fun with it. That's the main point. It was great fun last year with Pharaoh and Oliver Semiagog as judges, and I not entirely sure who the judges will be this year, so it'll be interesting. But we'll be doing that. Okay, so I think that's all the business. Let's get to the grim topic here. Okay, so yeah, hopefully the thumbnail, if you saw it, was enough to give you the general idea that this is not light stuff we're talking about, but it is not going to be getting into gruesome details really. This is a theoretical, an analysis of patterns in mass murder by states. And the name of the paper, so I've got two papers in the peer-reviewed journals. One is a co-author with Walter Block, because everybody co-authors with Walter Block in my circles. Anyway, and the other is this one. And so this is really my paper that comes out of the stuff that interested me for a long time. And it's called Stealing and Killing, a Property Rights Theory of Mass Murder. And it was published in 2007 after I presented it at the Mises Institute. And just personal story real quick, I guess I figured it'd be complicated to get a paper in the in a journal, because I'm not an academic, right? I don't have a university position, right? So I don't know how to do these things. Well, I gave the paper at the Mises Institute, and Robert Higgs, to be fair, a friend of mine, but a discriminating scholar. So I take it for real. Robert Higgs literally walked up. He had listened to the paper, walked up and said, "I want that paper for my journal." So indeed, the paper was published in the Independent Review, which is a publication of the Independent Institute, and Robert Higgs was the founding editor, I believe, of the Independent Review. He's retired from that now, but he was the editor for a long time. And Independent Review is excellent. I've been a subscriber myself. It's good stuff. So anyway, I was proud to be in the journal and glad it was that easy to make it happen. And also you'll find versions of my paper. They said you don't publish once when you do this kind of research. You do like your main paper, and then you do like a popularized version that's shorter somewhere else. So at the Foundation for Economic Education, there's another version of this paper, which is just a little bit less footnoted and cut down a bit, But anyway, my audience can take it for real here. So we're going to do this serious academic journal article. All right, so I open with a quote from John Locke in his second treatise of civil government. He said, "He who would get me into his power without my consent would use me as he pleased when he had got me there, and destroy me too when he had a fancy to it." So just in case that language was lost on you, let me use an example that might make sense to you, which is the Kyle Rittenhouse situation, where I believe even during the trial, the prosecution said, tell me if I'm being wrong, anyone who followed this better, but the prosecution said, well, you should have just let them give you a beating rather than defend yourself. Right? The assumption being
that was their line of argument, yes.
Yep. Okay. I thought I didn't imagine that. And so what Locke calls here is, he who would get me into his power without my consent. So they were saying, put yourself under their power without your consent, and they'll just beat you up or something. But Locke has a grimmer view of such a situation. He says, he who would get me into his power without my consent would use me as he pleased, and destroy me too when he had a fancy to it. So, I don't know how rationally Kyle, how much Kyle was thinking through all this, right? But in that situation, it actually didn't make that much sense for Kyle Rittenhouse to just submit himself to a beating because he might have been destroyed, right? Killed. And
Right.
indeed, during those riots last year, we did see a video of people that were beaten to a pulp or killed by
Yeah.
rioters. So it was entirely rational for him not to submit himself to that. So anyway, that's the point of the quote from Locke. Soon, I hope you will see why I opened with that quote. All right, now to set the stage here, R.J. Rummel is the fellow who really started to try to put some numbers and a term. I think he came up with the term. I'm not sure. He certainly popularized it. Everybody who uses it refers to him. Democide, demos, and side is murder, right? So murder of the people, right? So democide is murder of the people, typically by the state, a state. And Rummel is the one who wrote about this. He wrote about this in a number of books, by the way. One of the biggest is the one I'm referring to here, and my mind's going blank, so let me just go to my references. That's what they're there for, right? Yeah, here we go. So Rummel, 1994. Yeah, Death by Government. But as I mentioned here, there's also Lethal Politics, Soviet Genocide and Mass Murder. There's also China's Bloody Century, about all the democide that happened in China, not just under communism, by the way, not just under Mao, but under the nationalists and under the warlord era. That's why he calls it China's Bloody Century and not China's Commie Century, because Chinese people suffered terribly throughout the 20th century. Well, throughout the first 3/4 of the 20th century, I guess you could say. And not so before Mao came into power, there had already been a lot of mass killing, and then the communists came to power, and well, we all know how that goes.
Yeah,
Ryan,
put everyone
oh,
else
I'm
to
sorry,
shame.
Ryan. You mentioned to me that you know something about China, so didn't mean to cut you off there. Any comments you want?
No. I was
Okay.
just going to say that like anything that the Republicans or the monarchists did was put entirely to shame by the communists who took it maybe even exponentially greater in terms of deaths and destruction than
Yeah.
any of the previous
Yes.
civil wars or warlords did.
Right. I mean, according to Rummel's numbers, I would say this, Ryan, that had the communists not done what they had done, then the previous killing of Chinese by other government, by previous governments and warlords and such, would have been one of the great genocides of the 20th century, or it was a great genocide of the 20th century. But then the communists came along and killed so many more that you like hardly hear about what happened before them. But it doesn't mean that we should. It doesn't mean we should belittle what happened before them. It's just that what happened under the communists was just even worse. So
Right.
what is it?
They
Papa's
didn't.
phrase: "Worse than bad." Right?
Right. They didn't just indiscriminately kill people out in the street. Well, some of them did, but that wasn't the goal. They
Yeah.
completely destroyed any historians, any people that had any memories of before the communist regime, and they completely, essentially, wiped the slate clean and started from year zero. So you don't hear about just how terrible everything was beforehand, nor do you hear about how bad this was in comparison to all of those, because they were all destroyed and gone and killed. It's it's dystopic in a way.
I encourage people to go have a look at kind of the belief system of nationalist China and several of the other warlords in the warlord era of the 20th century in China, because they were not the same ideology as something you would think of as the United States, Great Britain, or France. They had very much their own way of looking at the world, which resulted in their own sorts of democide. So I would encourage people to go have a look at what they believed and why Chinese history is so bloody in that sense. But the other point I would like to, and I mentioned it in my little statement there, is the idea of France, Britain, and the United States, and the democide that happened around Southeast Asia and in Africa, because we also have to remember that they were incredibly bloody, yet often overlooked, because, well, decolonization is viewed as an incredibly good thing, but the chaos that surrounded that post decolonization and these new governments forming was immense and often overlooked.
Okay, so that's Rummel, and my paper is, you could say, a response, or better, the way I try to frame it here is building on Rummel's work, but taking it in a different direction. So, how does Rummel come to think about this mass murder by governments? Well, okay, so sorry, I meant to say there's sort of two parts to what he did. One part is that he just tried to get a sense of how big the mass murder was. So that's these books like China's Bloody Century and so forth, and Death by Government. He has books uh, that are devoted to the major democides under the Soviets, under the Chinese communists, under the National Socialists, the mid-century Germans, as we call them, right? I think those
Right.
are each three separate books. Those are definitely three separate books. I don't know that he does any other separate books on democides. Yeah, I think all the rest are covered in Death by Government, where he then deals with like Cambodia and some of the other things you might know about. So to some degree, he's just trying to do an accounting, like how much of this happened, right? Um, but then he turns to a theoretical perspective, and that's really what I'm addressing here. And his theory focuses on the role of the state, which I assert here was a big step forward from previous theories that focused on, quoting Rummel, cultural, ethnic differences, outgroup conflict, misperception, frustration, aggression, relative deprivation, ideological imperatives, dehumanization, resource competition, etc. So there are a lot of different approaches that were taken. Often, as Rummel points out, they fall down a little bit because they're extremely focused on one particular situation,
Right.
and they're not stepping back and looking at the big picture of all the different kinds of democide. So it'll sound plausible if you're just looking at one of these scenarios, and then you switch to some other scenario, like you go from National Socialist Germany over to Communist China, and their theory just doesn't seem to fit at all what's happening in China.
Right. It hits a brick
So
wall.
is there a way to
Yeah.
is there a way to make a general approach that helps us understand these democides across these different political, ethnic, so forth, geographic situations, right? So that's what Rummel attempts to
A
do,
consistent
and I
theory.
attempt to improve on him. So, go ahead, Mad Merc.
A consistent theory that can generally, if not specifically, account for the large proportion of democide that has happened around the world.
Right, exactly. So that's what Rummel and I are up to here. So,
And if you
go ahead.
if you do get this full theory, I'd recommend teaching it to your children about the time that they'd reach high school age, because the public schools will teach students about mass killings, but they'll use what Rummel just described as the insufficient explanation. And, it works really well for whatever narrative the public schools craft, whether it be, the National Socialists, or if it's, ethnic conflicts in Africa. But then when you try to apply it to any other state, of the same principles to any other state, you run into brick walls, and then you end up with people that are trying to actually justify, Stalinism or Maoism or something like that, because the floodgates are open. This we warned about it over here, and it doesn't apply over here, so it must be fine. This general theory would be good to have.
So Ryan, you tell me, having recently been in high school, I'm going to make a joke, and you tell me how far off my joke is from the truth. Here's my joke. What they basically teach you is the explanation of state mass murder in school is that conservatives got into power.
Yep. Every single time.
You're thinking that's pretty much it, right? Yeah. People voted for Republicans or the moral equivalent, and then there was mass death, right? I mean, that's essentially what they're going to tell you. So, right, yeah. Which, let's say, is not a very good way of understanding what happened, to put it mildly. Okay, so here is how I characterize. Now, this is not his words; these are my words. Here's how I characterize Rummel's theory, because I'm going to contrast it with the way I comment it. Right, his theory is a regime type theory. So you look at the type of the regime, the type of the government, and that tells you um, how much killing there's going to be. So you have totalitarian dictatorships. They're the most deadly. Authoritarian regimes, he calls them, are still deadly, but less so. And then democracies are the least deadly, okay? And here's how he makes that look pretty plausible. And let's see how this is fitting on the screen. Terribly, okay. These are, I'm not going to be able to show you all at once, unfortunately. Deaths in millions from democide compared to deaths from international war. Okay, can I get, oh, this is terrible. Okay, trying to get this on the screen here. Okay, there we go. Almost right. Okay, hopefully you can pretty much see it. Now, what you're seeing is the black bars are total democide. Oh, what is democide? Democide is mass murder of civilians. Okay, we would not count in this combat deaths. That isn't to say that combat deaths are just or okay or anything like that. It's just a classification. It's just saying that war deaths, deaths, man in uniform fighting on a battlefield, that is not going to be in the count of democide deaths. Democide deaths are, what you picture from a Holocaust movie or something, right? There's a little old lady and she's being put in a camp and worked to death or gassed or something like that, right? Or shot, That's a democide. It's not a combat
It's a difference
personnel.
of category.
Yeah, it's a category difference. So, couple things. Well, Ryan, why don't you comment on what struck you first of all about this picture before we get into the Democrat versus authoritarian, totalitarian stuff?
When I first got this paper, when it was first sent to me, I just looked over it. Usually look at the figures or something like that, and you can see where a paper's going. Most of the time, if the author's good. I saw this one, and it was what struck me wasn't that the totalitarian had much greater than everyone else. It was that international warfare was so minuscule compared to just the total democide across the board that it was absolutely maddening to me that we haven't been worried about this or talking about it before. It was insane to me.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That is the first thing before we even get into quibbling with Rummel about, democratic versus totalitarian and all that. First thing is what he himself tries to emphasize in his book Death by Government, and that is that democide is a really big issue in the 20th century. And probably not just the 20th century, but certainly the 20th century. If you understand this, then it feels like, and I remember, I started on this when I was 11, by the way, on this topic, believe it or not, 40 years ago. And at a very young age, I thought, why isn't everybody talking about this like all the time? Like, this is massive. This should be like what everybody is trying to figure out. Like, how did it happen? How can we prevent it from happening? So yeah. Okay, now Ryan said minuscule, and I felt a little wince there because we're still talking about,
comparatively
40. Yeah, we're still talking about 40 million people who died in wars in the 20th century. Absolutely horrifying, right? But the democide deaths are, I should have this number in my head, but it's, 220 million or something like that he comes up with. And by the way, these are estimates, definitely quibblable. Rummel himself would tell you that. He's doing his best based on looking at what various people have estimated and sort of doing a statistical average. And anyway, you can see his math in his books. He explains how he comes up with these estimates. He's trying to get in the ballpark. He knows that we do not have down to the person figures on this that are accurate. Nobody does.
I mean, even if you cut out like 60 million or so, you're still much higher than the international warfare part, and that's the thing that's meant to kill people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Go ahead, Matt Byrne.
What I was about to say is that, most people know about the big ones, but I think the way that he's able to calculate what are the smaller ones and incorporate them actually takes it up higher than what most people think. Most people are estimating around 150 million people, but then they forget the smaller ones and they lose 100 million people in that calculation that were killed. So I think his count is a very accurate one.
Right. Okay, so having absorbed that enormity, and that is the reason that I spent all those years reading about this stuff, is because democide is, in terms of people dying, it is a bigger issue than war, believe it or not. Not unrelated to war entirely, but a bigger issue overall. Okay, so yeah, right. So having got absorbed the enormity of that, now let's step back and see what he's done. What he's done is he's sorted these deaths into democratic, authoritarian, totalitarian, and there you see that in terms of war, authoritarian and totalitarian are in the same ballpark. Democracy is less, according to him. And then, but if you look at democide, you start to see like you feel like you're seeing a correlation here, right? Democracies are not killing people in camps in large numbers, and totalitarian regimes are, and authoritarian not nearly as much as totalitarian, but a hell of a lot more than democratic. So you can see what he's saying here. This is his regime type theory. All right?
Right.
Okay. Now I'm going to critique it. That's what the paper is. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned the full accounting, total number. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Just a point again to praise Rummel, because he really is sort of the father of the field from my point of view. No one had really tried to come up with a number for total Nazi mass murder victims, because they'd focused on particular groups like Jews or Gypsies or whatever. He, as you learn, for example, the deaths of Jews, even if you accept some of the highest numbers, are dwarfed by the number of Slavs that were murdered by the National Socialist regime. Ukrainians and Russians and so forth. Poles. His most recent estimate is that 262 million civilians were killed by governments in the 20th century. Sorry, I didn't have that number in my head. 262 million. Okay, yeah, we talked about that. Okay, so in this article, I present a property rights theory for understanding how governments came to slaughter unarmed civilians by the millions and tens of millions. And what we're trying to answer are, first, how does government gain the capability to murder millions of civilians? And second, what, if anything, can be done to prevent such monstrous crimes? Seem like pretty obvious things to think about, right? Amazing, as Ryan commented, amazing how few people seem to be thinking about that. Okay. So, right, he focuses on the structure of government, pointing to the centralization of power as the primary problem, and to political freedom and decentralization of power through democracy as the solution. Well, even in 2007, before I met Academic Agent or knew about elite theorists or any of that stuff, I already smelled a problem here, okay? In my property rights approach, I point to systematic invasions of private property rights as the primary enabling acts. So let me make the contrast clear here. The questions are, how does government gain the capability to murder millions of civilians? He points to centralization of power in an authoritarian or dictatorial ruler. I point to invasions of private property rights. What's the difference? What's the distinction here? Hopefully it'll become clear as we go. And so what can be done to prevent such crimes? Rummel says, make everybody democratic. Rummel, in fact, I don't want to bias you too much, but he would have been like, what's the George W. Bush thing, guys? The
neoconservative.
Democracy. Yeah, kind of inclined that. I wouldn't call him a neocon exactly, but he would be inclined to support like the global democratic revolution that you saw George W. Bush talk about, or the people around George W. Bush talk about, right?
A war hawk, or not a war hawk, but a
neocon.
Well,
kind of. But basically, the idea is, look, if all these regimes were democratic, they wouldn't fight each other. That's a different. He's got this democratic peace thesis, which I'm not addressing in this paper, but they wouldn't fight each other. We'd have less war, and they wouldn't slaughter their civilians, and so we wouldn't have democide. So we need to spread democracy, and that's the solution, right? Well, I disagree with that approach. Okay, so he's saying we need to spread democracy. I'm saying we need to defend private property rights. And I hope my paper will make clear why I go in this direction. Okay. But I go further. My proposed approach implies that, contra Rummel, democracy is not part of the solution, but rather part of the problem, because both democratic ideology and democratic practice undermine private property rights. So if private property rights is key, as I'm going to argue in this paper, democracy is not helping you, it's hurting you, because democracy undermines private property rights. I think a lot of my audience already follows me at least on part of that democracy undermining private property rights. Okay, so, right, so first let me give you a little bit of Rummel's prose, because I was very concerned in writing this paper, and the editors, Robert Higgs and the other editors, they pulled out some of the stuff I shared, which was, I guess, just too emotional or whatever. But I was really concerned about writing about this topic in a way that was entirely dry and bloodless, you know? And Rummel is the same way, by the way. When you read Rummel, he writes with tears in his eyes, you know? I mean, he does not write about this in an inhuman way. He writes about it really feeling the enormity of the crimes he's writing about. And so I tried to bring some of that through in the paper, because this is just a topic, you know, you just can't talk about it in a super abstract, dry way. It's just not appropriate, you know. So anyway, quick quote from Death by Government by R.J. Rummel. A systems approach to politics still dominates the field of political science. Through this lens, politics is a matter of inputs and outputs, of citizen inputs, aggregation by political parties, government determining policy, and bureaucracies implementing it. We might call this like the textbook version of democratic government, right, Ryan? You know what I mean? It's like that.
Right.
The civil religion version of things, something like that.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's a civil religion that they teach you in the public schools, so that you go out and worship it up until your death, essentially, as some institution that works perfectly.
Right.
Some might say people went to their death saying, "Long live Stalin." I mean, democracy. I mean, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I just realized. Okay. All right. So let me continue. Then there's the common and fundamental justification of government, that it exists to protect citizens against the anarchic jungle that would otherwise threaten their lives and property. Such archaic or sterile views show no appreciation of democide's existence and all its related horrors and suffering. They are inconsistent with the regime that stands astride society like a gang of thugs over hikers they have captured in the woods, robbing all, raping some, torturing others for fun, murdering those they don't like, and terrorizing the rest into servile obedience. This exact characterization of many past and present governments, such as Idi Amin's Uganda, hardly squares with conventional political science. So, I love this passage. It could have come from someone like Rothbard, right? This is how we view the state. But Rummel's not even coming from that sort of libertarian theory point of view. When he writes this, he's coming from the point of view of having studied Idi Amin's Uganda, Mao's China, the Cambodia of Pol Pot, et cetera, right? And he's saying, this is your government. This is your government that you tell us is there to like protect its citizens. And if without the government, we'd just be in anarchy and it'd be terrible. It'd be all against all, you know. Yeah, well, what do you say about this kind of situation, right? That's what Rummel's saying. So anyway, I hope you didn't mind me reading that quote. I just feel like, again, paying tribute to him and how solid he is in a lot of ways on this. Okay, so now getting back to my theory here. So what does this theory offer that can supplement or amend Rummel's regime type theory? You know, democracy versus authoritarianism versus totalitarianism. So first, if you focus on the regime type, it doesn't help you understand the cycles of mass murder under the same regime type. For example, the peaks and valleys of mass murder by the government of the USSR, which was a totalitarian dictatorship from beginning to end. So if you actually map across time the mass murder in the USSR, it isn't just a straight line across, where just every year they just kill a certain number of millions of people or whatever. It isn't. There's peaks and valleys, right?
Right.
And his theory doesn't help us with that, because he just says the USSR is a totalitarian dictatorship and they're going to kill a lot of people. But it doesn't tell you, well, why'd they kill more people at this point and less people later? His theory just doesn't help us with that, right? Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I think my theory is helpful. It shows, not only suggests that a totalitarian regime would be murderous, but it also shows where the peaks and valleys of killing will be. The peaks would correspond to determined efforts to collectivize, in the case of the USSR. That is, to massive assaults on private property rights. And they say collectivize. It's like collateral damage, right? It's another one of these weasel words. Collectivize is massive theft, right? It's stealing everybody's farms. And,
Right.
Yeah, massive theft and redistribution that ultimately ends up in everyone starving. It's
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, collectivize.
Yeah.
a euphemism.
Yeah.
Right.
And maybe, can I put something forward at this stage, rather, just
Okay.
before you get too in depth into it?
Yep.
I don't think what Radleb is writing here is that the reasons behind, like, we can predict the reasons behind the property theft to begin with, correct? We're just saying, or rather, this paper is saying, when property theft increases, then we can generally say that there will be an increase in deaths.
Right.
It's not suggesting the reasons behind why the property theft hasn't increased. It could be could be for a multitude of political reasons.
Yeah.
For example, the Great Purge by Stalin, or the Great Leap Forward, or any of these sorts of stuff. Right.
Different
justifications,
different justifications, different ideological kind of scenarios potentially, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
But the general rule being that no matter the justification, when property theft goes up, you will see an increase in these killings.
Right, exactly. So just to finish the sentence there from the paper, so the peaks would correspond to determined efforts to collectivize, and the valleys would correspond to retreats from collectivization, which also happened, by the way. If you know your Soviet history, you know that there was a period called the NEP period, the New Economic Policy period.
Right.
This was after what's called wartime Bolshevism, something like that. Those first several years
yes.
where they were really going for it, and they were like trying to abolish money. I mean, I don't know. It got pretty nuts. And
You had
and
go
ahead.
on.
Yeah. No,
I was
if
going to
know
say
the
you
history,
had
talk about
major
it.
you had major members in the Bolshevik part of the Russian Communist Party. People like Leon Trotsky. You had Vladimir Lenin. Famous generals at the time, if I remember correctly. I want to say Tukhachevsky was one of them that were pushing.
And, Kerensky, I think? No.
No,
Yes?
Kerensky,
Kerensky
was
was
the
on the
leader
other
of the.
side.
No, sorry. Who was Brusilov?
And so what you had with these groups of people, they were very zealous. They weren't necessarily the full Machiavellian pragmatists that you might know them for later in their lives. During the war, they were pushing to completely usher in communism in the wartime, while they still have the hearts and minds of the people they were fighting for, and absolute control over the state that they were under. And it did not necessarily work too terribly well. Their army started facing shortages, and they ended up losing several major battles. The Civil War eventually ends, and they realized that it's not really working.
People were starving.
Yeah,
Worth mentioning that.
people were starving. A lot of the workers and peasants that they were supposedly freeing were starting to reconsider the whole communism idea. They could see a major disaster brewing, and so you had people like Vladimir Lenin and, if I remember correctly, is it Bukharin? Is that how you pronounce it?
Bukharin. That might be right.
Yes, that's it. Those two in particular pushed for, if I remember correctly, they called it market communism, which might sound like an oxymoron, where they basically wanted to take a semi-capitalist system on the surface and have the government just oversee the whole thing to make sure that communist ideals were embedded at every single part of the process, but you still had some sort of mechanism mimicking a price to make sure that things were getting distributed where they needed to go. So they went from one end of the spectrum, which was abolish all private property, abolish prices, abolish money, and then they reinstitute it, and it starts to work much better. And then this eventually gets destroyed by Joseph Stalin, and if I remember correctly, it's called the Great Turn or something like that. And he basically goes back to a more Bolshevik-leaning policy, but he doesn't go the whole way. So you still have, if I remember correctly, you still have forms of private property.
Yeah, not quite as extreme as what they tried to do with wartime Bolshevism or that initial period.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. That's good.
And then
ahead.
after Stalin, not to continue too far into this point, because I know you want to get back to the paper, but
well, we're going to have a graph.
this,
Actually, if you could wait just a moment, we're about to have a graph on the screen. Or actually, let's get that up there, and let's make sure people can see it. Yes, good.
I have the article in front of me. Which graph are you going to?
So figure 2. Go to figure 2, and you'll see that the Civil War period saw some significant democide, and that's what Ryan was describing. And then it continued in the net period, because remember, they're still like consolidating power and shooting people, but it drops, right? But then it goes up during collectivization, and that's that Stalin period. That's the Holodomor in the Ukraine, right? And other Black Earth areas, I should say, not just the Ukraine, as someone was pointing out in our community.
you might wonder with the explanation I gave, if Stalin only went, kind of in the direction of full wartime communism, then why does he have so many more dead? When they were implementing wartime communism in the Soviet Union, they did not have full control over what we now know as Russia or the Soviet Union. It was just their little pockets of control in the major cities. So
right.
Stalin,
there was the Civil War, and the whites still controlled certain parts.
Right. Yeah, major parts of Siberia, major cities in the east as well, or in the west rather.
The South also was under white control.
So if you had wartime communism over the entire territory of Russia consolidated, it would be much higher than collectivization, and it would make Stalin's little collectivization here look like a decrease. But thankfully, they were limited by territory and control. So that's the explanation there, in case anyone was wondering.
So with collectivization, I think Mad Merc was about to go into the post-collectivization, but real quick on collectivization. So with collectivization, Stalin has, as everyone knows, has eliminated rivals, consolidated control. He's totally in charge, right? And then he says, okay, now it's time to get back to putting Bolshevism into practice. And he very methodically starts taking all the food away from the farmers and things like this. And many people die.
These are the 5-year plans.
The 5-year plans, the era of the 5-year plans, that's right. So were you going to comment on, now that you see that figure, were you going to comment on some of these later periods, Medmer?
Correct. So after Stalin has his stroke, so in 1953, I believe he has a stroke and he dies. There's obviously a power struggle in the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev comes to power. And, you have this period of de-Stalinization. You have this period of easing of restrictions in the Soviet Union. You have a greater focus on food production. Reason being is that after post-World War II, much of the land in the Ukraine had been devastated by war, and there was a great shortage of food. The collectivization didn't help to such an extent that during Khrushchev's reign, food became one of the front page stories in newspapers, on the television, on the radio, because people were starving still after the war. Right, and so you see this easing of restrictions within the Soviet Union, and you see in the post-Stalin bar there, it's significantly lower than the post-war and the collectivization period. Now, again, it's more than the Great Terror, and I don't think anyone would deny that the post-Stalin era was a great place to live. But we can see that with these easing of restrictions, with the granting of more, private property rights within the Soviet Union to more efficient workers, that there were less deaths. So it upholds your theory, rather.
Right. Thank you. So that's Soviet. And then I bring up the case of China, to give you an idea of why I think this approach helps. So in the case of China, a focus on regime structure, again, merely indicates that China has been under a communist dictatorship for more than 50 years, right? But with a property rights approach, it calls our attention to the significant changes in property rights in China in recent years, right? The Deng Xiaoping and post era, and predicts that large-scale democide is unlikely, despite the regime types being nominally the same as the one during the Great Leap Forward. So in other words, from a Rummel point of view, you don't have very much resolution. You just say, hey, it's, totalitarian dictatorship run by the Communist Party. There's going to be all this mass death. Well, how do you explain the fact that the Great Leap Forward was terrible in China and so many, many people died, and nothing like that is happening now? By the way, if you followed me on Twitter, you might see that I've been very skeptical of the Uyghur genocide stories, and I've dug into it and found evidence for my skepticism. But you can see why I probably was skeptical just from the beginning, because 14 years ago I published this paper where already I'm saying, yeah, I don't think the Chinese government in terms of how it's functioning with property rights is setting itself up for the kind of mass murder that it did under Mao. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that this approach has something, there's a reason to dig into it. Okay, so I'm not just saying correlation, though. When there's stealing, then there's killing. And isn't that an interesting coincidence? I'm not arguing for causation as well, okay? A property rights approach gives us more insight into the dynamic of how a state gains murderous strength and the people become weak so that the state can kill so many people. So remember, power is not, in my view, like, energy conservation, what's that law of physics about energy is always conserved or whatever? I don't view things that way. I think power, as I understand it, is something that grows and shrinks. Not all societies have a network of concentration camps, right? I would say if you're living in a society that has a network of concentration camps, you probably have a more power in play than a society that does not have a network of concentration camps. Okay, so hopefully you understand what I mean when I say that. Okay, so if the devil asked Rummel, "How do I murder tens of millions of people?" Rummel would have to answer, "Establish a totalitarian dictatorship." To which the devil would respond, "Fine, but how can I put myself in a position to do so?" The property rights theory is better at advising the devil. That's how you test a theory. The property rights theory then explains that the path to mass murder and the path to a powerful centralized state is the same, and that the key is to attack private property rights. And then I talk about socialism. I don't think... I'll throw this in red meat for my right-wing audience, right-wing members of the audience. From the perspective of property rights theory, it seems clear why the greatest mass murderers were avowed socialists instead of, say, right-wing military dictators such as Francisco Franco. And this, right, Ryan, is one of the things that we get because of our history being given to us by left-wingers. They would kind of, if you press them, maybe, and they knew their stuff, maybe they wouldn't say it, but they kind of create the vague impression that, Hitler, Franco, Mussolini, they were all sort of equally horrible right-wing baddies, right?
Right.
But those of us who actually know more about the details of these different regimes know that it's not very useful. It is of extremely limited use to throw Francisco Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler into the same bucket. Like, I don't know how much you get out of that. You follow me?
If you they do this because they want to if you look at the 20th century and all the big scary parts that they've been hyping up in the public schools ever since they teach you history, they will only look at about 1919 to 1950, right? And most of the dictators at that point in time would be considered right-wing. You had Francisco Franco, you had Salazar in Portugal, you had the Estado Novo in Brazil. You had a bunch of Latin American dictators that had basically, seized the reins of a dying democracy and took it over, for better or worse. Some were better than others. And you had also, rising figures in, parts of Africa or India that were more right wing than some of the communists that would later take over those states. If you can just paint them all as under one broad brushstroke and say, well, evil totalitarianism did all of this, your mind is going to jump to, the majority of these guys were right wing, but the most deaths came from Stalin. So I guess they were all this way, right? Like they were all these scary, terrible dictators that just killed tons of people. Or even the mid-century Germans might come to mind as well, in, total number of deaths. It's a very weaselly way to have to get out of the fact of explaining, well, most of these right-wing dictators didn't just kill people for the sake of it, like the communists. You had, especially in the Latin countries, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil, these people were actually concerned with keeping their countries together, and as such, could kill very little people, if any, on purpose, because that's just going to destabilize the country. And then you had, left-wingers and socialists that are just killing people for the sake of an ideology, because that's all they care about, or for the sake of maintaining power. It's a complete difference in foundation.
Well, let me finish what I say here. Right, I mean, it seems sort of obvious to say what I'm about to say, which is basically, hey, shocking news, guys, socialists attack private property rights. But anyway, I'm contrasting yeah, I know. I'm contrasting the like of Francisco Franco. Attacks on private property rights in socialist regimes were not a side effect of another goal, such as defending the country, suppressing a dissident religious group, attacking a particular race, right? So I'm sort of listing some things that you might associate with like right-wing regimes, and yeah, right-wing regimes probably violated some property rights in pursuing some of these goals, but it was like a side effect. But for the socialists, attacking private property rights was their explicit and avowed ideological aim. It comes as no surprise then that the revolutionary socialists who really meant business, attacked private property rights repeatedly in deadly waves of collectivization, dekulakization, great leaps forward, and so forth. All right? Okay, then turning to imperialism, I say that the property rights theory helps us to understand how the same type of regime can behave one way at home and another way abroad. At home, the regime may face resistance at every turn from long-established property rights traditions. Abroad, the regime does not face these constraints in dealing with the natives. A recent case in point is the gun grabbing by the U.S. forces in Iraq, in contrast to the still relatively well-armed population of the United States itself. So it's the same regime from a Rummel point of view, right? The same regime, the U.S. government, is grabbing everybody's guns over in Iraq, while at home, we all, Second Amendment, we all keep our guns. Well, how is that possible, right? Well, from my perspective, it's because the invasion of property rights in Iraq that was going on was entirely different than what the U.S. regime was doing at home, right? And of course, one way of talking about sort of the Second Amendment folks, Don LaPlave and friends like that, and NRA types, well, not NRA, but more extreme defenders of gun rights, they're basically afraid that the U.S. government will do to us what it has done to other places, but anyway.
Right,
okay.
Yeah. That's a good point. I wouldn't just skip over it. Like, if the government will do something to a group of people over there, they'll do the same thing back at home if they get the chance. Like, they've already displayed the willingness and the capability.
Right. Yes. And that happens a lot.
Past behavior.
Yeah, and it happens a lot, by the way, not in terms of gun grabbing. We've held them off so far on that. But there are things that get trialed basically out in the U.S. empire and then brought home. That definitely happens. Okay, now, democracy. Where the regime type theory holds up democracy as the solution to mass murder, war, and other types of regime violence, the property rights theory argues that because the principle of democracy, at least in the modern sense, has nothing to do with the protection of private property rights, and in practice undermines such rights, it promotes violence. And here I'm citing Hoppe, right? and we've discussed this to some degree in our discussion on democracy versus monarchy, the Hoppe stream. The relevance to democide is illustrated by events in Germany, whereas Hayek argued a period of democracy laid the groundwork for a dictator to emerge. And now I'm quoting Hayek in Road to Serfdom, I believe. In Germany, even before Hitler came into power, the movement towards centralized economic planning had already progressed much further. It is important to remember that for some time before 1933, Germany had reached a stage in which it had, in effect, to be governed dictatorially. Hitler did not have to destroy democracy. He merely took advantage of the decay of democracy and at the critical moment obtained the support of many to whom, though they detested Hitler, he yet seemed the only man strong enough to get things done. So Hayek's arguing that democracy laid the groundwork such that when Hitler came to power, he already, to a great degree, he was just taking something over that was already quite invasive of property rights, among other problems. Okay. And then there's the issue of regime change, and I already referenced this, but worth hitting. You can see my anti-imperialism all integrated into my thinking here. So the regime type theory has been used as a justification for regime change. A policy, what do I mean by regime change? I mean a policy of sanctions, military invasion, and occupation, and other means intended to change an undemocratic regime into a more democratic one. The reasoning is all too familiar. You have to break some eggs to make an omelet. In this case, the omelet is democracy, which it is hoped will result in less democide and a more peaceful regime, thus justifying in the long run all the short-term collateral damage and other destruction. And here I get to quote from Joe Stromberg, an old friend. Go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, with the you say short-term collateral damage, but how long were we overbuilding democracies across the world? I don't think it was necessarily short-term.
Yeah, no. Exactly. Yeah, Afghanistan for 20 years. Yeah. Joe Stromberg, who is a historian, by the way, Ryan, if you've never seen that name, worth looking him up.
I've seen him before, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, Joe Stromberg explains why the means of imperialistic war is incompatible with the proposed goal of constructive change. And this is what we were sold under George W. Bush. We're going to go out and we're going to make these people be democratic, and they're going to be so happy that we've come to save them from their horrible regimes and replace them with democratic regimes. In all probability, revolution from the outside is the most costly and counterproductive, not to mention least revolutionary approach to revolution. The characterization of the war as revolution raises the very important issue of modern Bonapartism. That is confusion between a war of conquest and revolutionary war. Imperialist war strengthens statism and destroys the material welfare of the people. As such, it is profoundly anti-revolutionary, no matter how it unsettles the defeated enemy's society. Okay. So, in the property rights theory, I would encourage, instead of regime change, an increase in justice, which is to say an increased respect for private property rights, or to put it another way, a decrease in robbery, not to put too fine a point on it. Nothing in this perspective suggests that a wave of injustice, such as liberating a country's population by means of shock and awe aerial bombardments, can serve as the path to justice. A theory of decreasing mass murder that encourages mass murder has a serious defect. There I'm, taking a strike at Rummel's theory. Okay, so that all was to try to justify why I think we should have a property rights theory of democide, and now I turn to the part of the paper where I lay it out. It's not too long of a paper. I think we can do this. Okay, comments before we move on, gentlemen? If any.
Nothing to add. I think it was beautiful.
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Okay, right. So, what stands out about democide in the 20th century is not the discrete crimes of passion, such as the killings in Tiananmen Square, but the systematic bureaucratic killing that took place over years. Okay, so think about the distinction I'm making here. I'm saying you have a little, overreaction from the state, say. Okay, here's a good one. The Kent State shooting, right, Ryan? Where 4 student protesters were shot by the
During
National
integration,
Guard.
yes.
Oh, it was during integration. Okay, I
Well,
thought it had to do with Vietnam War.
I don't like.
protests.
Well, okay. With integration, you have the state or the federal government really amplifying their rhetoric with the National Guard, and it has them basically on a hair trigger for the entirety of the rest of the century. So integration and the Vietnam War start to really mix once you get to about that point in time. So, yes, the main point and what the history books will tell you is that it was the Vietnam War protests, and look, this terrible government shot the anti-war protesters, but there was also a lot of funding coming in from a lot of integrating or desegregating institutions that really put these people there and made them a lot more flamboyant than they otherwise would be. Which is why you don't hear about,
context.
which is why you don't hear about, other anti-war protests where the state just goes out and shoots them, because, for the most part, they weren't being funded by these massive institutions that wanted things to really start happening.
Would it happen to be a couple NGOs? Any chance?
Did they
It
have
depends
those
on
back
how you
then?
define it. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that there were a few foundations that supported these groups, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, good point, Mad Merc. A new theme that we're following lately in our circles: the rule of governance, right? NGOs and so forth. Okay, so right. So what I'm saying is, my theory is not going to help you necessarily with something like the Kent State killings, though. Turnip's comments make me think that that's a bad example, and there was something systematic and bureaucratic involved there. But anyway, let's assume for the moment, Tiananmen Square, Kent State killings, there's some kind of uprising and the government sort of lashes out. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about industrial killing, right? Bureaucratized, systematic, happening over time, using resources, not the kind of thing that just, oops, or what's another good example? What was the compound where they burned all the children and everything? Waco, right? That's what I was thinking. I was thinking of Waco. Maybe there's others.
Baseless
yeah.
and soulless killing.
Yeah. So that horrible incident in Waco is terrible, a terrible injustice. But I'm not going to be able to give you a whole lot of insight about it, probably because it wasn't like something they were doing every month. I'm looking at these cases where they are killing the kind of numbers that they killed at Waco, but they're doing it like every day, for months, for years, right? That brings something different to the table when that happens. Okay, so this aspect of democide, the killing millions of people over time, seems especially amenable to economic, or more precisely, praxeological analysis, because the killing took place over time, used resources, and even involved something sort of like capital investment, like building camps, right? Mass killing obviously is not a market phenomenon. So rather than talking about the praxeology of cooperation, which is what economics it basically is, we are turning to the dark side of human action, which is the praxeology of aggression. Okay, so praxeology of aggression, and here we get some theoretical groundwork. Rothbard presents the fundamentals of praxeology of aggression in Fundamentals of Intervention, the second chapter of Power and Market. He starts with a simple two-person situation, an aggressor and a victim. We know that aggression causes a loss of utility for the victim, right? They don't want whatever was just done to them to have been done, but it causes a gain of utility for the aggressor. So the aggressor thinks, at least before they do it, that this is going to benefit them. They're going to get their jollies, or they're going to steal something from the person or whatever, and the victim is going to lose. So that's our basic simplistic analysis going on.
It's turning something that doesn't have to be zero sum into a zero sum game out of malice or any other explanation for it.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
But
thievery doesn't produce value; it only transfers value by force.
Right. Exactly. When aggression is not incidental, that is, it's not just a one-off. Somebody's mugging somebody. but it's systematic or even institutionalized, such as the case of state aggression, broader consequences result. So social conflict is created in the scramble to go from being the victim to being the aggressor. So, right, you see that this is happening, and if it happens over time, then people start reacting to it, right? They're like, I don't want to be the guy on the receiving end of this aggression. I want to be on the other end. So, as John C. Calhoun pointed out, this scramble gives rise to the creation of antagonistic classes. And by the way, I don't remember if we've done this on the show, but class analysis actually started with the classical liberals, and Marx took it and turned it and made it terrible. But Calhoun gives an example of what we'd call sort of pre-Marxist or classical liberal class analysis. And that is that you've got the people who are aggressing is one class, and the people aggressed against, the victims, is another class. Finally, the indirect consequences are such that many interveners themselves will lose utility ex post. So, the socialists think they're going to make the world better by collectivizing, and then they find that they themselves are starving because it turns out that collectivizing is not a great way to run your economy, and people start starving, and even some of the people in the aggressor class start suffering. Okay, so that's your basic, very capsule summary of praxeology of aggression. Now, Hoppe argues that systemic aggression against property changes the time horizon for individuals. This is the famous time preference thing, right? So he's saying that it's going to raise time preference. Lower time preference means that you're more future-oriented. Higher time preference means you're more present-oriented. He says that it's going to make you more present-oriented when there's systematic aggression. Because incentives for producing for the future are reduced, future income and consumption are also reduced, which results in that rise in time preference. Hence, the length of the production structure will be shortened, and a decrease in the output of goods produced must result. So systematic aggression is going to, reduce the productivity of the economy, right? Taxation discourages time.
Right.
Go ahead. Jump in, guys.
Well,
first.
This is a point that he brings up in Democracy, the God That Failed, in regards to how governments first formed and how monarchs first formed with essentially people with swords coming in and imposing a protection racket. They found that the people who they were stealing from became less and less productive, and therefore instead of just violently and randomly stealing from them, they just set up protection rackets. So, Democracy God That Failed brings this up in that book.
Yeah.
The shortening of production, not opportunity. What was it? I'm sorry, it's early in the morning here.
Well, think about it. Ryan, go ahead. You had a thought?
Yeah, I was going to put this into summary. If you make the fact that you might not even have a future a possibility, like if you make a future more uncertain for someone, they're going to value time more because like the time that you have is precious. It goes up in value in their minds. So you're not going to plan as much for the future as you would if you knew you were even going to have a future. If the state isn't just killing off people, indiscriminately or discriminately. So that's how this plays out in the minds of the person whose time preference is lowering under this bureaucratization and mass killing.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so taxation discourages time-consuming but productive efforts to earn income and encourages instead short time horizon methods, including stealing or legally seizing goods through politics. In short, systematic aggression against property results in increased time preference, short-term consumption becoming more preferred to long-term consumption. Also, you get decreased output of goods and the more aggressive scrambling for money obtained by ordinary and political theft. All of which implies, as an upshot, a more and more short-sighted and violent scramble over an increasingly smaller pie. Thus, aggressions against external property are problematic in several ways. So, what's the problems with aggressions against property? First, such aggressions constitute a violent attack on a person through an attack on the things the person owns. When they are legal, then a property owner's resistance to them will result in official violence directly against his person. And I want to really emphasize this because attacks on private property rights have been glorified in our modern world as idealistic and socially minded for a long time, right? If you care, then you would want to support welfare state and so forth, right? But I want to point out that this is like rape, okay? And here's my analogy. Rape needs to be viewed primarily as a violent act rather than as a sex act. So aggression against property needs to be viewed primarily as a violent act rather than as a manifestation of idealism, if we're to understand how it plays its role in mass murder. And I hope I don't have to spell this out, that you know, it's leftists have somehow given themselves the moral high ground while they advocate, and because supposedly they're advocating for aggression against property. We're the ones who care because we want to violently take your stuff. It doesn't make any sense, but okay. Second, successful aggression against private property rights removes the use of the property from the rightful owner's control. Loss of property has consequences, but the one that is most relevant to democide is the loss of the ability to protect oneself. If your guns are taken or other means of self-defense are taken, loss of the ability to be productive, and therefore the ability to command resources for consumption. So if people take your stuff, you're less able to provide for yourself. Think about me with 10 to provide for here, counting myself, right? Myself, my wife, 8 children. If you cancel me, take my property, steal from me, so forth, I'm now in a worse position in terms of being able to provide for my family and being able even to defend my family, especially if you particularly target my ability to defend myself. You come in and seize all my guns or whatever, right?
Correct.
So further consequences of attacks on property. So it weakens me when you attack me, right? And it empowers the aggressor. It empowers you, the attacker. Owing to control of the property acquired through aggression, the aggressor will probably have an enhanced capability to perpetrate even more aggressive violence. Okay, so it feeds into a cycle. And finally, a successful theft may reduce the incentive to reacquire property because the victim perceives such accumulation as pointless. The property will just be taken again. And this is where you get that time preference impact, right? Why should I build up my business if FDR is going to come along and tax me at 80% or what, right? And by the way, as we've covered in a previous show, that actually happened. There was a big decline in private investment under the New Deal, because people were widely concerned that FDR was basically a commie, which wasn't too far off, and was just going to seize their businesses and so forth, right?
Yeah, 2 things on that point. The first one
Yeah.
is that he did have open communists in positions that he appointed them to.
Yeah.
And the second point is that that's a decline in investment from the point where the stock market crashed in 1929. So he somehow
Right.
made that worse with his
Yeah.
actions.
That's a good point.
And again, I know this point has been brought up on the show before, but the seizing of assets is a violation of property rights on many levels. So again, when he banned the ownership of gold and silver, that was a direct assault upon the people of his nation, and that's the seizing of private property, a private property that's incredibly valuable to hedge against any kind of instability within a nation. So evil on many levels.
Okay, so next point in the paper. Aggression against external property is necessary for systematic democide. Okay, so it disarms the victim. I think I hit this. It takes weapons away, takes resources used to sustain, defend their lives. Is this theory just a tautology? Violence is a predictor of violence. No, because the thesis is specifically that aggression against external property usually precedes aggression against person. Okay. Furthermore, aggression against external property enables aggression against person by all those things I said, transferring resources from victim to aggressor, lowering the time preference of both, creating conflict where there is harmony, etc. Because democide takes place over periods of time, the victims must be prevented from running away and from effectively defending themselves. Thus, attacks on property are essential to a successful democide to keep the victims helpless and foreclose their alternatives. So imagine going into, I don't know which state to pick, Texas or something, some place associated with high gun ownership, right? And the government comes in and starts, going house to house victimizing people. Well, soon enough, they're going to find that people are firing back at them, right? And what's going to happen? Well, they're probably going to step back and go, okay, if we're going to keep this up, we want to slaughter Texans for some reason, right? If we're going to keep this up, we're going to have to do something about all those guns that people are using to stop us from killing them, right? And they're going to start paying attention to an attack on property, right?
Right. If I can put this into an analogy that some people might understand, or not necessarily an analogy, but the underlying idea there, for example, is why No Country for Old Men could not happen. If you have a serial killer that's just going around and shooting people, and after about the third guy, this starts getting out there, people are going to start, sleeping with their rifles and, preempting anyone opening the door. Let alone if a government starts doing this with all the pomp and monstrous, regiments that it has. It's not going to be just one person sneaking in and out. It's going to be the government coming to your door with whatever they determined to be necessary. That's going to get people, they're going to do a little bit more than just sleep with, a firearm by their side.
Correct. We've seen in the past that people go to extreme lengths when they believe that they are genuinely under threat. They organize into groups.
Yep.
They obviously form organizations within official organizations. So this would be counterintelligence and intelligence within governmental organizations. So there's a whole level to this. But people go to extreme lengths if they believe that they are genuinely threatened. Threatened.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we don't accept the Wall-E view of humans. That they just sit around and just passively sheep-like accept it. Though, the last year or two are challenging our views on these things. But anyway, okay. So claim number 1, aggression against external property is a necessary condition for systematic democide. Part of how I support this is by the counterfactual. Was there cases of systematic democide not preceded by aggression against external property? Well, one difficulty with this scenario is, how do the murderers come by the resources to kill on a large scale over time without first stealing? They could just use their justly acquired property. And I just say, though not strictly impossible, the scenario is unlikely, and I don't think we see it in history. A second difficulty pertains to explaining how the victim population is rendered powerless to flee, defend itself, to respond in the ways that Mad Merc was saying. Hire other people for defending it, right? If they hadn't been looted and disarmed in the first place. One possible response to this counterfactual is, the victim population has been disarmed ideologically. That is, they have the resources to defend themselves, but they do not choose to do so, because they've been convinced that the regime may legitimately kill them. And such an unusual situation verges on mass suicide. And that's a different phenomenon from the one that I'm dealing with here. I would say that as we think about these cases in the 20th century of mass murder, people were not lining up to be killed. They did not want to be killed. They did try to resist it as best they could. Famously the big city in Poland, Ryan.
Warsaw.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for example, right?
Yes.
And there's many other scenarios where
Yeah.
people were not just sitting there being helpless victims; they were fighting back
There's
as
a
best they could.
right. That's there's an even weirder one, if you will. There was a very interesting personality involved in the, if I remember correctly, it was the Vilnius ghetto in Lithuania. You had someone who basically wanted revenge against the Germans, and so made it their life's goal to kill 6 million of them in a sort of revenge genocide. Never actually went through with it. The poisonings he did do killed, I think, no one, and they just made violently ill 3 people. But even then, you had uprisings across parts of Eastern Europe. None of them necessarily had great success, but they didn't just sit around and take it.
Correct.
Okay.
And
Go
yeah,
ahead,
sorry,
Edmer.
No, it was a point that was irrelevant. We can continue with the main point.
All right. So now turning to socialism, which obviously in the 20th century, as you can figure from some of the regimes I've been mentioning, it's definitely part of the story here, right? Communism or socialism. So in the case of a communist system, the attack is mounted not simply on external property in general. I say external property, it's kind of a technical term. I just mean we have property in ourselves. I'm just calling that like internal property, I guess. External property would be what sometimes in the old writings called several property, property that we can part with without dying, right? So our houses, our things, that's external property. Anyway, so communists don't just like randomly attack external property. We want your toothbrushes, right? No. They are going after the means of production. And this fits right into what we've learned, right, about from Austrian economics about the significance of the means of production. Mises, in his socialist calculation argument, which we've discussed on this channel, demonstrates that where capital is socialized, calculational chaos will ensue. At the extreme, the economy will break down altogether, and the advantages of the division of labor will mostly be lost. This consequence alone may be enough to account for the murderous famines that invariably accompany all concerted efforts to socialize. And just in case you haven't noticed the pattern, try to think back to some of the big famines you've heard about from the 20th century. The famine in the Ukraine, the famine in Ethiopia, the famine in China after as part of the Great Leap Forward, I believe.
Right.
And I have not sat down and studied every regime, but I think nearly every serious communist takeover, like people really trying to put communism into practice, has resulted in a famine where like people really die on a big scale.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's why it becomes a meme where when people joke about communists or whatever, they'll send like a retort back about people starving or something like that. That didn't just come out of nowhere. Like most mimetic ideas, it has basis in reality that's inseparable
history.
from the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So Mises are. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
I think even the communists after a while have addressed this because they understand it's a pretty big turnoff to have your private property seized, and so I think the distinction that they've made is personal property and private property.
Mm-hmm.
So personal property being something like your phone, and private property being the means of production. So the factory that made the phone. I'm not familiar as to the finer details of the argument, but I think they even try to skirt around this issue.
Right, except what
But
I'm arguing
obviously,
here, is that it's just the means of production you want. Well, that's exactly the thing that is the worst
Correct.
thing to attack, right? I'd rather you took my toothbrush than the ability to make toothbrushes, right?
We only want to seize the heart out of your body. We don't want the other parts.
Exactly,
Yeah, right.
It's
Exactly.
you can have your lungs and your brain. It's just the heart.
Right.
Requires
Okay.
everything else to function.
So Mises argues, as we know, it's impossible for a government to take over an economy fully and run it rationally. A full government takeover can only destroy an economy. And we see this outcome in the British Empire's camps in Kenya, the Soviet work camps, the Nazi work camps. See what I'm doing there? I'm saying that these camps are little government-run institutions. And there's a reason why so much misery, disease, and death is associated with them, because they're literally little, and in some cases not so little, examples of full-on government central planning. And they just fail in a lot of cases. These forced labor projects exhibit the ultimate subordination of people to the plan. And the workers, rather than being extremely productive for the state, often simply perished from starvation, disease, and abuse. There have been then real instances of full communism in which the means of production were truly socialized, money was abolished, the entrepreneur had no role, and everyone was guaranteed work, indeed was compelled to work. The concentration camps, also known as death camps, constituted the fullest practical realization of the Marxist economic program. And Hoppe talks about this, and he summarizes the economic effects of socialization as including a drop in the rate of investment, wasteful use of capital, and a drop in the general standard of living. But we can say more based on our understanding of distribution in the market. Rothbard writes, personal distribution, how much money each person receives from the productive system, is determined by the functions that he or his property performs in that system. There is no separation between production and distribution. It's completely erroneous for writers to treat the productive system as if producers dump their product into some pile to be later distributed in some way to the people in the society. Distribution is the other side of the coin of production on the market. Or as Hoppe puts it, from the standpoint of the natural theory of property, there are not two separate processes, the production of income, and then after income is produced, its distribution. There's one process. In producing income, it is distributed. The producer is the owner. So what's the point of all that? An attack on people's ability to produce differs from merely stealing someone's output for the day. A person who has lost his productive capacity has lost the ability to demand consumer goods in the market. And this is another reason why socialism has been so deadly, right? Socialism's victims are left without the means to draw goods to themselves to meet their basic needs. They become entirely dependent on bureaucratic distribution, which, as the calculation argument suggests, will be ineffective even if the regime intends to feed them. If the regime decides to starve them, however, it can do so with deadly effectiveness. So hopefully you follow the argument there. In the market, we're able to consume because we produce. Well, the government takes over the means of production, and now it's in charge of distribution, right? And so when it says those who do not work will not eat, right? It can really put some teeth in that and say, you guys have been some trouble, you deplorables over there. I think you're not going to get any distribution for a while. We'll starve you into submission, right? I'm not just making this up.
Correct.
Regimes did this in the 20th century for real. Yeah.
Correct. So, for example, the Ukraine was under Stalin. There was intentional starving of the Ukraine to depopulate the Ukraine and move Russians into that region.
Right. And to get them under heel. They just had been kind of problem. They were deplorables, right? They were not submitting as fully to the program.
Specifically in the Ukraine after the collapse of the Russian Empire, it was one of the more staunchly nationalist and fiercely independent states that came out of it. You had Cossacks that made their way into Ukraine and were determined to be under it rather than any of the other powers there. So, very militant group that had been so for most of their history. You had normal Ukrainian citizens who'd finally seen independence for the first time in, I think, maybe since the medieval era, that, along with seeing the ideological horrors, saw also the racial hatred between the two states. That serves as a motivator for them because, the Russians weren't the only ones that hated one group of people. The Ukrainians hated the Russians. But also, if someone just wants to exterminate you based on race, you now have something to really fight for. And they weren't the only ones, but they were the largest ones. They had the largest land mass of people that just wanted to stay completely independent. and they had the largest concentration of population in one area so that it could be productive, which is why basically all of the Soviet Union's efforts at centralization focused on Ukraine first throughout its history.
Correct. 100% correct.
So all of this leads to claim number 2 in my paper: aggression against people's means of production is even deadlier than generalized aggression against external property, which is to say, socialism is more dangerous than mere looting. Now, we know about looting, right? We know about Viking raids, and they were pretty rough, as I understand it, in some cases. But I don't think they had the kind of consequences that imposing, seriously trying to impose communism on a population had, right?
Right. And in some parts, and some parts of the places that they conquered, they ended up just establishing kingdoms and trying to pretend like they were supposed to be there and were the rightful rulers.
Yeah,
right.
They weren't always the violent rapist, burn down the monastery types. They oftentimes it was people, usually second sons looking to build their own kingdom because they weren't going to inherit the one back home. Which is how you get, Vikings in Sicily or Normandy or, parts of England.
But it's how you get the Dane. It's how you get Danelaw or Danegeld, is it? Where in England, after the Vikings kind of settle in the north, and they set up their own kingdoms, and there's a different law that goes up there, and there's a mixture of the Nordic gods and Christianity, and the eventual conversion of the Vikings and Danish people into Christians. So it's that sort of process that, yes, they may be raiders at one time, but this is not the systematic, ideologically driven killings that we saw in the 20th century. So in comparison to communism.
Okay, we are going to make it. All right, got about 5 more pages left in this paper. Well, 5 or 6. Okay, all right. So now, socialism, public slavery. So sort of extending now this our thinking here on what it means for the government to take over the means of production. So when they socialize the means of production, everyone becomes an employee of the state, right? If they own all the workplaces, basically, then they're your boss ultimately, right? They're the CEO. If you go up, they're the real CEO. So what jobs people may take, whether they work, their rewards and punishments, all are determined by the state. As Hayek writes, economic control is not merely control of a sector of human life which can be separated from the rest. It's the control of the means for all our ends, right? What, you contributed some of your salary to a church? That church teaches some pretty spicy stuff about LGBT. I think we're gonna have to fire you, right? You see what Hayek's saying here.
Yeah, I see the application.
Yeah, it's coming. Unfortunately, it's becoming a little relevant in our lives these days. The people become slaves in fact, de facto, if not officially, de jure, but they become slaves of an unusual sort. So Hoppe explains that just as socialized capital is depleted, in the manner we've discussed, right, with calculation problems and all this, so also socialized labor receives lowered investment, misallocation, and overutilization. So misallocation results from the lack of a competitive market for labor. So just as the Soviet Union couldn't figure out, how many nails should we make and how much of that should we do, and to allocate material resources properly. Well, the same thing happens with workers, right? You don't have market competition for labor because you don't have independent entrepreneurs. And so you get misallocation. So one pictures the school teachers and skilled craftsmen working in the killing fields under the watchful eyes and guns of the Khmer Rouge. That's not a very good use of their time, right? Probably. But from the Khmer Rouge's point of view, that's what they did. Overutilization results because with the worker's income largely subject to the caretaker's control, these partial temporary owners have an incentive to use up the labor without regard for the long-term consequences. In public slavery, the worker has no resale value. And in the extreme, laborers are just worked to death. And many millions were just worked to death in the 20th century. If you're picturing that 262 million, that they were all shot or that they were all gassed, that's not right. Many people just were worked to death. You find this if you read the Gulag Archipelago, for example, that this was the case in the Soviet
And
Union, right?
so one of the popular ideas that would go around, especially in the collectivization period of the Soviet Union, where not only agriculture was collectivized, but also most industries. The idea was basically, well, the Tsar kind of sucked in some ways for us, but he at least slept. He didn't have a foreman over our backs for the entire day, making sure that we met a quota, so that the state could just take it from us and give us little in compensation. At least back on the farm or whatever, when we were just peasants, we at least got to grow our food and keep it, and then the Tsar would only take a little, once a year. The Soviets have these people sitting behind our backs, and they've worked us to death. This is if you ever get the idea that the Soviet Union is kind of soulless and purely just utilitarian and extracting every bit of utility out of its human population as possible, this is the foundation for why. It's because every human there is just reduced to a statistic, a possibility of production. How many new things can I get from this person if I work them this much harder? That you just don't get under any system.
Okay, I believe in the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn, he mentions that in comparison to a serf, not even a peasant, a serf, who was owned by someone else, well, the serf got Sundays off for church. The serf got holidays off, which amounted to about 80 days in a year because of religious festivals or national days. And the serf had to be treated well by the Lord because if he worked him to death, then he would have no more serfs. And the serf was allowed to stay with his family, and the serf was allowed to keep a portion of the crop that they pulled in.
Right.
And the serf, who was ostensibly a slave, is more free than the so-called worker who the regime is meant to be looking after.
Right. Exactly. Well, this notion of public slavery is kind of a novel one to a lot of people. So I included this at length from Papa, where he contrasts the case of private slave ownership, like in antebellum America, right, with that of public slave ownership, which, as it existed in the former Soviet Union, in the Eastern European Empire of the Soviet Union. So here's Hoppe. Just as privately owned slaves were threatened with punishment if they tried to escape, in all of the former Soviet Empire, immigration, with an E, right, immigration was outlawed and punished as a criminal offense, if necessary by shooting those who tried to run away. Moreover, anti-loafing laws existed everywhere, and governments could assign any task and all rewards and punishments to any citizen. Hence, the classification of the Soviet system as slavery. Okay, so first he just wants to convince you this was slavery, okay? But it wasn't the same as private slavery. Under a private slave owner, however, Eastern European slave owners, from Lenin to Gorbachev, could not sell or rent their subjects. I'm sorry, did I say unlike? So unlike a private slave owner, however, Eastern European slave owners, from Lenin to Gorbachev, could not sell or rent their subjects in a labor market and privately appropriate the receipts from the sale or rental of their human capital. Hence, we classify this as public or socialist slavery. And here's the part that is surprising, maybe, for those of us who've brought up. I mean, they've been bringing up slavery all over again as if it's like just happened yesterday, right? In recent times. Tearing down statues of people who had owned slaves 200 years ago and stuff. So he says, here's the thing that might be surprising. Without markets for slaves and slave labor, matters are actually worse, not better for the slave. For without prices for slaves and their labor, a slave owner can no longer rationally allocate his human capital. He can't determine the scarcity value of his various heterogeneous pieces of human capital, and he can neither determine the opportunity cost of using this capital in any given employment, nor compare it to the corresponding revenue. Accordingly, permanent misallocation, waste, and consumption of human capital results. The empirical evidence indicates as much. While it occasionally happened that a private slave owner killed his slave, which is the ultimate consumption of human capital, socialist slavery in Eastern Europe resulted in the murder of millions of civilians. And thus, claim number 3, successful socialization of the means of production reduces the people to slaves whose lives the regime has neither the incentive nor the ability to preserve. So again, focusing on property rights, right? And the relationship to murder. Okay, then I go into a little thing that I felt convinced I had to mention, and that is the issue of gun control. Don the pleb alert time. Okay, in Death by Gun Control, Zellman and Stevens argue that gun control has preceded all the mass murders of the 20th century. They summarize their thesis in what they call the genocide formula. Hatred plus government plus disarmed civilians equals genocide. So here's how they explain it. How does gun control relate to genocide? This should be really easy based on what we've done so far in this paper, but let's see how they put it. As explained in this book, gun control schemes try to make it unpopular and then relatively rare for private citizens to own and use firearms. Anti-gun laws make it more costly and risky to have guns. Anti-gun rhetoric weakens the spirit of people to be armed. Licensing, registration, and safety inspection laws do more than discourage firearm ownership. By enforcing these laws, the government creates a list of people who could possibly resist tyranny and oppression. As shown in this book, evil governments use such lists to locate, disarm, and eliminate firearm owners from the population. When the firearms are confiscated and the defense-minded people gone, only the defenseless, unarmed people remain. The third element of the genocide formula, the only one that the people can directly control, is in place, being armed. So this important argument fits very well into a property rights approach to democide. I would emphasize, however, that stealing the means of production is perhaps even deadlier. People who still can demand goods on the market, owing to their ability to produce, can procure new means of defense. So the deadliest combination is gun control plus socialization. Take away the people's means of defense and their ability to acquire another means of defense, and they are left truly defenseless before the power of the state. So there's my little side note here on gun control. Okay, how are we doing? All right, we're going to get there. So, ideology and democide. So far I've argued that a massive invasion of private property rights, especially the right to produce, is a prerequisite for democide, but I've not considered how this invasion comes about. How does a regime that ultimately rests on popular opinion get away with such horrendous actions? And ideology holds the key, but we have to be very careful here. Violators of external property rights do not always embrace an explicitly anti-property ideology as the communists did. So, for example, the deadly economic sanctions against Iraq were not justified by an anti-property ideology, but in the name of democracy, freedom, and regime change. The socialists were especially deadly, though, because they precisely and consciously aimed their attacks at property rights. As we examine ideologies with elements of socialization, we should expect to find some of this same lethal effect, though not as much as in outright socialism. So attacks on property also go by other names besides socialism. Militarism, which includes the subordination of private property rights to the state's military machine, played a deadly role not only in the Nazi regime, but also, we are learning, in Mao's regime, as Mao focused on building up military power. So remember the Great Leap Forward, they were going to industrialize? Well, it was partially because of, Marxism says that, you need to go from rural to industrialization, and then you can achieve the communist state, a communist ideal, right? So he needed to get to that industrialization, but also he was looking to make China stronger militarily, right? The industrialization, he wanted to build weapons, right? So he was willing to take food from the mouths of the Chinese people for this purpose, and he often did so. Ideologies that announce their devotion to the race, to the nation, and even to freedom and democracy can also result in attacks on private property rights. So I argue then that this approach to democide makes more sense when we recognize that the 20th century, which had these colossal mass murders, was also a time of ideological rejection of classical liberalism's strong devotion to the protection of private property rights. Nobody liked the classical liberals. Liberals get the bullet too, as you might have heard. Well, that was true whether you were under a so-called left-wing regime, as Stalinist Russia, or a so-called right-wing regime, as Hitler's National Socialists. Remember, Mises was in Austria, and he had to get out of there so he wouldn't be killed. Well, partially because he was a Jew, but also because he was one of the great classical liberals. What?
He had to flee, more importantly, because the Germans took over Austria. It should be noted they were, a right-wing dictatorship before Hitler took over. That wasn't the issue. It was more just, the mid-century Germans specifically took it over that caused him to flee.
Correct.
Right, that's true. It was he, in fact, Dolbertus or something. What was the Dolphus? Ryan?
Dolphus, yes.
Was it in Austria?
Yeah,
Dolphus, yeah. And I thought Mises advised the Dolphus regime actually, but
yes, he did.
Anyway,
he was one of their main, if I remember correctly, their main Chamber of Commerce advisors.
Right. Yeah, Mad Merc, you had comments?
Oh, I was just about to say the statement of right wing dictatorship being National Socialist, I think will cause a lot of triggering in the chat. So,
right, and right wing. I don't care about left versus right that much, really. As you can see in this paper, I'm more interested in what are they doing, So even those that were nominally committed to freedom were rejecting private property rights, as with FDR and the New Deal, right? So that's the 20th century. Like even in the supposedly, liberal democracy of the United States, private property rights are under attack, so much so that businessmen stop investing because they're afraid they're just going to get their businesses outright seized by the state. That's like the least bad area. You go to Europe, and everybody's got some cockamamie scheme for destroying private property rights, right? So it is no coincidence, however, as I keep saying, the century's deadliest regimes were explicitly socialist, and they featured an announced ideology of enmity towards private property rights. Socialism leads to dictatorship. Hayek argues this in Road to Serfdom. A regime that massively invades private property rights will tend toward dictatorship as a side effect. Reisman explains why socialism, understood as an economic system based on government ownership of the means of production, positively requires a totalitarian dictatorship. And these arguments don't really tell us whether socialism or dictatorship plays a larger role in facilitating mass murder. We may note, however, that throughout history, many regimes sought the kind of power over society that was finally achieved only by the regimes with an ideological and practical commitment to the elimination of private property rights. That is, wouldn't, Caligula, Napoleon, wouldn't they have loved to have the kind of power that a Stalin had, for example, or a Mao, the kind of total power? But it only happened when they put the attack on private property rights front and center. So anyway, a stray thought. Okay, then finally, war. According to Rummel, most democides occur under the cover of war, revolution, or guerrilla war, or in their aftermath. So there is a correlation of war, of course. Over the life of a regime, the more disposed it is to be involved in deadly foreign and domestic wars, the more likely it will commit democide, whether or not carried out during these wars. This is because totalitarian power not only underlies democide and genocide, but also because this power underlies as well the occurrence and intensity of war. So that's his perspective. From the property rights approach to democide perspective, my perspective here, war plays a causal role in empowering a regime and in compromising property rights. Modern democratic war in particular, and I use the term democratic there in the Hoppian sense, very broad sense. It's made massive taxation and conscription leading features of the state, starting with the French Revolution and the French Revolution militant, right? War is the health of the state, as Randolph Bourne pointed out. The state gains strength. The people who are subject to it become correspondingly weaker. Government interference with business and socialism, writes Mises, creates conflicts for which no peaceful solution can be found. What has transformed the limited war between royal armies into total war, the clash between peoples, is not technicalities of military art, but the substitution of the welfare state for the laissez-faire state. So Mises does not think that, the democratic welfare regimes are necessarily peaceful. During wartime, we are likely to see the warfare state, swollen with stolen men and goods, commit genocide against foreigners. Given his natural human aggressiveness, Hoppe asks, is it not obvious that the state ruler will be more brazen and aggressive in his conduct toward foreigners if he can externalize the cost of such behavior onto others? That means we all pay for it while he's murdering foreigners. Okay, and then I'm going to skip a little bit here because I'm talking about Rummel sort of dances around and changes his theory a little bit, so I try to address that. I'm going to kind of skip that bit. Okay, so let's then finally compare the theories to wrap this up. Okay, so comparing Rummel's theory and mine. We might agree, for the most part, with Rummel's static picture of the two types of regime. Respect for private property rights will lead to a more decentralized, spontaneous society, whereas systematic invasions of private property rights will lead to centralization and, at the extreme, to dictatorship. Yet, that leaves us with little sense of the dynamics of how either regime gets to such a place. In other words, from Rummel's point of view, it's there. You've got this totalitarian government, it's killing people. My theory tries to explain how it gets there, right? Rummel's enthusiastic endorsement of democracy leaves little room in particular for understanding, as I see it, how democracy actually contributes to the deadly move toward the massive invasion of property rights. So, here are the points of agreement between Rummel's approach and my approach. First, what about, quoting Rummel, what about cultural ethnic differences, outgroup conflict, misperception, frustration, aggression, relative deprivation, ideological imperatives, dehumanization, resource competition, etc.? At one time or another, for one regime or another, one or more of these factors play an important role in democide, yet none of these factors applies to all democides. So these are interesting factors, but they kind of are case by case. We're talking about something that is broader in both our cases. Second, the state's power is the common denominator. Power is a necessary cause for war or democide. And then thirdly, most democides occur under the cover of war, revolution, or guerrilla war, or in their aftermath. So on these points, Rummel and I completely agree. Here's where we disagree. The regime type theory points to democracy as the solution to democide. The property rights theory points to respect for property rights as the solution. The regime type theory points to a dictatorial form of government as the main cause of democide, whereas my theory points to massive invasion of property rights as the main cause both of a dictatorial form of government and of democide. Rummel spends little time on pre-20th century history. His classification of regimes suggests that monarchies would be classified as authoritarian, and that they should be expected to be more murderous than democracies, but less so than totalitarian dictatorships, in his simple regime-type classification, right? But the property rights theory judges each regime by its respect for property rights and notes that many European monarchies historically were far more respectful of such rights than modern democracies have been. Therefore, we would expect those monarchical regimes to have been less murderous than democracies, and that's a chilling sentence for me to read at this time in history. So let us pray, because we're not in a monarchy. Rummel tends to excuse or rationalize democide by democracies, by the United States in particular, for obvious reasons. The property rights theory, on the other hand, does not view democracies through such rose-colored glasses. I remember talking to Robert Higgs, I think, after I gave this paper and after he asked me to put it in his journal, and he said, yeah, Rummel's great, but he's really got a blind spot when it comes to the United States, because the way he's looking at things, right? So the millions killed in
Right.
Vietnam.
He lives here and hasn't he lives here and hasn't personally been killed. So I mean, what could the problem be here?
Yeah.
It's deeper than that, right? He's
Yeah,
democracy
but
is a high value for him, right?
if he,
Um,
I think, if he could see the conclusion of democracy, he might reconsider it.
right. So the millions killed in Vietnam, the million killed by economic sanctions against Iraq, the millions killed as a result of covert U.S. operations, the violence by France and Algeria. These incidents are no surprise for the property rights theorist who recognized the power that the perpetrating democratic regimes possessed, owing to massive amounts of stolen property and the lack of respect these regimes had for foreigners or certain foreigners. The property rights theorist accepts Hoppe's point that democratic regimes, being public governments, take a short-term caretaker view that results in sometimes treating lives as cheap. And finally, the regime type theory explains that the 20th century's deadliest regimes were socialist because they were totalitarian dictatorships. The property rights theory explains that their deadliness sprang directly from their socialism. All right, so that's my paper. That's my one solid paper that I have in the journal, so I'm pretty happy with it.
I don't know that it's the one solid paper. You've had more, haven't you?
No, I just have one other, and it's just a co-author, and it's not that exciting. This is the big one. In terms of a peer-reviewed journal. I'm talking about peer-reviewed, as opposed to articles. I've got plenty of articles, but on LouRockwell.com and Mises.org and stuff.
All of which I highly recommend for people to read because they are all great articles to read.
Thank you. You'll find my articles on LouRockwell.com and Mises.org, mostly.
I would just like to say to the audience, if they have time, go look for the article titled "No Government But God." That was quite the nice article. But with this paper that we just went over, it has a great quality about it, and that you can tie it into it. It works as it's supposed to. It's the general theory of democide, basically. General in the sense that it applies to all democides. You can tie it in. We've been tying it a lot into the Soviet Union, but you could also tie it into, the revolutionary slaughtering of the royalists. You could tie it into, mass murder going on in the modern day. You could tie it into anything in between. It's wonderful, and it fits in historically, I think.
Correct. Did you ever receive a response from Rummel in regards to your paper?
Well, he's actually passed now, sadly. I did write to him and had some correspondence. But he was older when I put this paper out, and I think retired at that time, so I didn't really expect to have him really come back with a big response, so that's okay. So any final thoughts on the paper, gentlemen?
I think that there's a lot of grim application that can be taken from this paper and applied to the modern day. If you are the kind of person that likes to look ahead into the future and try to plan for it accordingly to defend yourself and your family and, God's faithful. So,
Right.
there's a lot to take from this, as we usually get from, people like you and other people in our sphere. As I mentioned, I'd recommend looking forward.
Thank you. I did share the paper link just now in the live chat. If you want to, you can just pull the PDF down if you want a copy of it. I did mention on Millennial that I have an invitation, which I've been so busy I haven't done it, but an invitation to appear on the podcast of one of our friends in South Africa to discuss my approach here and how it's relevant to the situation of the Boers now in South Africa.
Correct.
Where I understand, and I don't know enough detail. I was going to bring the theory and let them bring the facts on the ground to help us understand how to apply the theory in that particular case, right? But from a distance, my understanding is that there are definitely attacks on property There's definitely an attempt to expropriate the Boers by the, well, fairly commie government, I think, that they now have in South Africa.
Yeah, I don't think they're really even hiding it, even since their foundation.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, now that I've gone back through the paper, maybe I feel ready to jump on and talk about it. I felt like I needed to refresh my mind on everything. Now I feel like I can go in and, sketch it briefly and then really focus on how to apply it to the situation in South Africa. But as Ryan said, I think it can be applied to a lot of scenarios, right? Okay. Well, Mad Merc, any comments before we move towards wrapping up?
I think it's a wonderful paper. Everyone should
Thank
go
you.
read in detail. I read it myself before the stream, and I think it's a very comprehensive look at the reasons behind, well, not the reason behind, but the general trend that the violation of an individual's private property will ultimately lead to the destruction of many individuals, both personally and then also the destruction of their society. Because we have to remember, when someone is killed, it is not just them killed in isolation of the people around them. Their death has an effect on their family, their family's friends, and it reverberates throughout the community. And when you have a mass death like that, it's a truly horrible event in that society's history that scars it, and you will always have the effects of that event. So
Yeah.
what we're talking about here has lasting effects beyond just the individuals that get killed or their immediate family. It's a truly horrible thing that scars the society.
Okay, let's hit a few comments. First of all, Sam153, I think he tends to do this. I think when he watches the show, like the next day, then he sends a tip in and Subscribestar. So he said tip for Econ Minis, and that was 6 days ago. So I think he was sending in a little tip for our show last week. So thank you, Sam153. Worth mentioning, I've noticed there's a lot of tips from him, and he's a regular supporter on Subscribestar. So great supporter of the show. Thank you. And of course, Mr. Super Chatter, Jedi Knight, Anakin Cringewalker, with two comments tonight. First, Nixon once mentioned that Mao didn't fear nuclear war, telling him something along the lines of, if you lose 400 million people, you're extinct. If I lose 400 million people, I still have 400 million left. Mao was pure evil. Yeah, so that kind of illustrates that whole point in the paper about viewing, having little value on the workers, on the people, right? Mao in that quote is treating his people as just something he can just spend, lose half of his
Right,
country.
they just
well,
become
whatever.
numbers on a paper.
And then next comment from Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker, he says, ironic that Stalin's brain didn't want to redistribute that blood clot. Interesting comment. Yeah, the blood clots seem to be an issue lately, but we won't get into that. Okay, so
Oh wow!
like I said, next week, 1 week from today, we're going to get some judges on. We're going to look at some amazing. We've already seen some great stuff this year from the flag competition, but it's not too late. Until Monday, you can still contribute a flag design, and I think we've not only been encouraging it, Mad Merc, but from the submissions, it seems to me that people have been doing it, like providing a backstory sometimes to explain like
Yep.
their real or imagined place that this flag is for, right?
Right. So all that we ask when people do the competition is that they submit a design, and then they just give a little bit of a back brief as to the what the flag is meant to represent. So maybe like the different colors or the symbols on the flag, what they're meant to represent, and then the fictional city-state that the flag is for. So if you want to have like a massive, like we've had people who've written paragraphs of backstory and lore to their flags and the nation that they've created, which is really cool. And some people have just written very short little one paragraph statement saying this is what the flag represents, this is what the flag, the city state that the flag is for, this is my design. And you can go as in depth or as little or as shallow as you'd like. It's all totally up to you, but we're just going to have a lot of fun with this.
Right, and there is still time. Not as much as last week, but there is still time.
A couple days, several days, yeah. So that's December 23rd for us, December 24th for Mad Merc. Are you going to be able to participate in that? That's Christmas Eve morning for you, Mad Merc.
Correct. I'll be able to do it.
Okay, great. And I have one judge who's already said he's willing, but I'd better double check time. And I have another judge I'd like to bring in for the first time this year. So, but I haven't even asked him yet, so I won't say his name. Okay, so anyway, looking forward to that. Support the show on Subscribestar. Hope you found this interesting. It was a scholarly paper, so we were going a bit deep, but I hope that it was interesting and you're able to follow along nevertheless. And let's see. Well, we could mention the series, right, Ryan? We don't have to mention a particular date, but we could. It is definitely coming. So why don't you talk about
the topic is out and
next year?
So after the start of the new year, and I think I can announce the person that we're going to have on doing it, because I don't think that there's any way we're doing the piece without him. Our third horseman of the apocalypse, the Black Horse, Patriarch, whatever you may know him by, Radlib, me, and then, God willing, Mad Merc, if he's still around, will be doing a series on 2008, the lead up to it, the actual occurrences of the meltdown, and then the aftermath. It's going to be a very comprehensive overview. Our wonderful guest for the series, he has a lot of knowledge about it. A very how would you describe it? He was there essentially.
Right. He was one of the boys.
In media res, you might say. So so we have him. You have my perspective, which is not going to be nearly as useful, but it is unique insofar as this is before the time where I became aware of such things. So this is history to me.
For you, it's history.
You have,
same.
And that'll be the same for Mad Merc. And then you have Radlib, who wasn't right in the middle of it, but was still very aware that it was happening. Got a lot of the literature absorbed to do with the topic. So all in all, it's looking like it's going to be a very great series, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because we tend to talk about, of course, 1929 and the stock market crash and so forth, because it looms large in the mind of Americans, not just Americans, in world history. But this has the advantage of practically being yesterday historically. I mean, the people involved are still alive, So I think it's going to be quite interesting to do something that isn't so far in the distant past, and we're still talking about companies that are still around, individuals that are still around, banks that are in some cases still around, right?
Yeah.
So should be good.
They're basically raised from the dead, from what I can tell. They shouldn't be alive, is one way to put it. They shouldn't be
around, but they exist in some form. So really excited to start that in the new year. We don't have a specific date down with Black Horse and everything, but that is that series. It'll be more than one show, is my understanding, Ryan, right? Definitely.
Right, yes. If all goes well, it should be 3 shows as how I outlined: the prelude, the actual event, and the aftermath.
The aftermath, right. So 3-show series on that. Should be some good, hard, it'd be economic history, right? We'll be doing some economic history.
Yeah. And in some cases, just the state of the world today.
Right. Yeah, it will. Oh, yeah. Worth, in shilling this, marketing this, Ryan, we definitely want to mention that it will bring insight on some current things. It will not just be about stuff that happened 13 years ago. It's going to inform our view of what's happening around us right now. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so totally cool. What a great fit for the show. Thanks to Ryan and Black Horse for quietly working away. Skunkworks project here, getting this ready for the show. Really appreciate it. Okay, I think we are done. And let's roll credits and see some of those supporters of the show. Thanks, everybody.